You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Klein.
In this episode, we talk about the interpretation or misinterpretation of Marx, known as value form theory. And in particular, I will be interviewing Andrew about a debate he had almost a decade ago with a prominent value form theorist named Patrick Murray. Whether you are new to the debate over value form theory or if you are already knowledgeable enough to have taken a side, you will still find this an interesting and edifying discussion. To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. You can also make a donation there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. In just a moment, Andrew and I will be talking about value form theory and his debate with Patrick Murray. But first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take a few minutes to talk about some current events. So the headlines this week are that the Trump administration's own internal CDC reportings predict that the daily death rate will be increasing up to 3,000 people a day by the end of the month. But despite this, we are barreling forward into this reopening of society, as they call it, in a completely laissez-faire, uncoordinated fashion. Every state and every county and every individual is supposed to figure this out on their own, what they think is safe. So we are solving this public health problem by letting people just make their own random decisions about things. In the meantime, neo-Nazis with AK-47s are storming the State House in Michigan, egged on by the President of the United States. Lysol Don, who is also encouraging citizens to drink bleach and shine lights into their bodies to fight the virus.
Yes.
There's my news summary.
Right. I mean, and when you spoke about the acceleration, of the pandemic, this is not just the natural spread that we're talking about. There's the natural spread, but then there is this concerted push from, obviously, corporate interests, from the right wing, from the Trump people wanting to be reelected. There's a concerted push to end the stay-at-home orders, to lessen them, to reopen the economy, reopen the country. What they're doing is they're saying, okay, the social distancing has worked. Okay, it's worked well enough that we can ignore it and go back and start killing people again. So that's the basis of the acceleration. I mean, right now we've been running in the United States about for a few weeks 2,000 deaths per day on average. Give or take some hundred. And they're expecting by the end of May, because of this relaxation of the stay-at-home orders and the social distancing and all of that, they're expecting it to creep up to 3,000. And basically all of the experts are saying, until we have a vaccine and or massive testing and tracing of people's contact, and quarantining of people, that doesn't look in sight. There's no end. There is no end to this, and it's going to get worse and worse. Until 70% of the U.S. population has been exposed to the COVID-19, and maybe, hopefully, nobody's even sure of that. The immunity will mean that you'll be immune by having had contact with it, which nobody is sure of at this point anymore. And it seems not to be the case from some partial information that we now have.
Yeah, it could be the opposite. It could be that repeated exposures are more dangerous, and then we have the complications of the fall flu season. So you're looking at like a total train wreck.
And now we're normalizing Nazis, good people on both sides once again, and the governor of Michigan should supposedly have sat down with Nazis and worked something out with them. Meanwhile, we should be mainlining Lysol. Right. And I want everybody who told us that Hillary would have been just as bad to tell me that if Hillary Clinton had become president, we would have had a president of the United States telling us to mainline Lysol and, saying there's really fine people, with the swastikas and the Confederate flags storming the State House, with armed people storming the State House in Michigan. That would have really happened, right?
Yeah, this is just totally insane. And then, what's driving me crazy is this, that we're reopening everything and with no plan. And now it's just become a matter of people's personal judgment about what they as individuals can calculate and deem is safe for them to do. And this is like not the way you're supposed to handle public health issues, because it's not a matter of individual risk calculation when it's a public health issue.
Right.
I mean, people are going to now be told by their employers, work is open, come back to work, and they have to decide whether it's actually safe for them to go to work without any actual information or guidance. So schools are going to reopen, and parents are going to have to figure out, is it safe to send our kids to school? Do we going to risk possibly, our own death or death of family members because we want to send our kids back to school, without actually being provided with the information someone would need to make that sort of risk-benefit analysis?
Right. I think even the experts can't tell you what the risk is right now. In statistics, there's a distinction made between risk and uncertainty. Risk is like when you can quantify the probability. There's a 10% chance, there's a 23% chance. Uncertainty is basically a measure of your lack of ability to do that. And there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in all the numbers we have. I mean, nobody knows what the death rate. That's a loose expression, but nobody knows what the death rate is from this virus. Individuals are being left on their own. States are being left on their own to make their own policy, to try to get their own supplies before the feds take the supplies away. The test kits, the protective personal equipment, all of that stuff. But the worst of it is, of course, this emergency wartime declaration that we got to reopen the meatpacking plants. And what's happening there is people are basically now being made into forced laborers. I mean, this is basically a form of involuntary servitude, because they're going to be denied, maybe they're already being denied unemployment insurance benefits and whatever relief if the workers in these plants don't go back. So they're not being given any opportunity to make their own decisions. And it's of course no accident whatever that these are workers, real working class workers, and it's absolutely no accident at all that they are heavily immigrant, and a lot of them probably undocumented. And I mean, this is it's not just craziness and incompetence and bumbling. There is that probably coming down from the administration, the Trumpites. But there's a tremendous amount of racism, permeating all of this. And it gets talked about as, urban-rural divide. But, I mean, what has happened to date, as we know, is who has suffered the most in terms of mortality? Black people, immigrants, as well as old people, right? But so you're getting all of this right-wing kind of like pushback against the stay-at-home orders, the social distancing, all of this, because at some level, the white population, better off or rural, thinks that it's relatively safe and that it can, benefit off of the backs of the black people and the immigrants. Okay? It's not going to work in the end, I don't think. I mean, from what I know about the spread of this disease, which is, well, nobody really knows, but it's just coming slower to the populations that are not as dense. It's coming slower because they're not as dense.
Yeah, I'm still wondering if the reality of death and disease will somehow pierce through the thin veneer of propaganda that Trump has spun around this thing.
Maybe. But, some of these rural areas are like, well, they got, 200 deaths or something, but that's in the local meatpacking plant. And that's basically, immigrant population that has little contact with the quote, white people, in the area. Mm-hmm. So, wherever you've got statistics, there are these divisions between who's really heavily affected and who's less. But if this thing, I mean, as long as biologically, we're all pretty much the same here, which is the case. As far as I understand it, you get slower spread, you get faster spread, but if this keeps on going, without quarantining, without isolation, tracing of people's contacts, it's going to spread. And when it spreads, the places that have gotten hit, relatively mildly so far, it's only a matter of time before they get hit heavily. And then what's going to happen? Well, it's interesting. I mean, Amanda Marcotte in Salon, I think yesterday, wrote a piece, and she just said, yeah, this is going to happen to them. And are they going to learn their lesson? No, they're just going to change their tune and blame it on, the people in New York and the people in China and whoever for doing it to them. They're just going to pivot, and instead of saying they were wrong about the social distancing being needed, they were wrong about the stay at home, they're just going to blame everybody else. So there's not going to be any learning. That's her estimation what's going to happen. It was a good piece by her.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this current events section. Up next, our discussion about the value form theory. So, Andrew, the plan for today's podcast is to be talking about value form theory, or the so-called value form paradigm, which you are a critic of. Specifically, we'll be discussing criticisms of value form theory that you made a while back, and Patrick Murray's response to you. You made your criticisms of the value form paradigm in a paper entitled "On Capitalism's Historic Specificity and Price Determination, Comments on the Value Form Paradigm." And Murray responded to you in a paper entitled "Avoiding Bad Abstractions, a Defense of Co-Constitutive Value Form Theory." So first, I think we're going to need to give our audience a little bit of context here about what value form theory is and why they should be interested in hearing your take on this debate. So can you start us off with just a quick overview of what value form theory is?
Yeah, sure. It's a strand of Marx-inspired value theory, whether it's said to be Marx's own position or a better version of what Marx should have said. That depends on the particular person. But it emphasizes the role of money and markets to capitalism and money and markets to value. And it began there are precursors, but it really began in the 1970s in response to the Schraffian, neo-Ricardian, whatever, allegations that Marx's own value theory was internally inconsistent. And what the value form people, or whatever they called themselves back then, were doing was trying to evade the whole issue. And what they did is say, well, Marx had this embodied labor theory of value, this quantitative theory of value, and that's inconsistent. Or you're misinterpreting what he did as a quantitative embodied labor theory of value. He had another one, maybe it was his only one, maybe it was his, Sunday best value theory, that's qualitative and deals with abstract labor and, basically tells us that value is, ultimately determined when the goods are sold, and the commodities value really is the amount of money for which it sells. And, since that's basically standard neoclassical mainstream economics, what it says, the allegations of internal inconsistency cannot be lodged against it. So you're defending Marx by basically saying, well, what really is Marx's theory, or should be Marx's theory, isn't internally inconsistent because it's no different from standard economics.
So we'll get into some more specifics later on in the interview, but for now, can you just say in general what it is you find so objectionable about value form theory?
Sure. Let me first say that, there's not one unified value form school, so not all of my criticisms apply equally to all of the value formists. But just generally speaking, I don't happen to like their theories, but I do think they're entitled to them. And I don't think, you should judge theories by whether you like them or not, but, there's certain criteria for evaluating theories, how successfully they explain and predict phenomena, and are they internally consistent? Not whether you find them personally attractive. But by the same token, Marx is entitled to his theories too. And in that regard, I think that the behavior and writings of many, if not most, value form theorists and Marxist economists and radical academics generally, their behavior and writings are quite objectionable in not allowing Marx to have his own theories. They attribute their ideas and musings to Marx. It's their idea, but they say it's Marx without adequate grounds for saying that. And sometimes also they allege without any adequate grounds that there's inconsistencies or ambivalences, is another term, in Marx that need to be fixed with their stuff. I think that's really deleterious to the forward movement and development and progress of ideas, because who's going to want to produce, any intellectual products, articles, books, research questions when, your legacy is that people come along and they make of it what they want that's in their interests. People wonder why we don't have more people like Marx. And I think that's part of the reason is look at what they've done to him. Who wants to become the next Marx under those circumstances? Also, I would say, just in terms of academic practice, I think that value form people, like the other academics and radical economists and stuff, they have not been very good about trying to resolve disputes with their critics, investigating the matters, debating, having criticism to try to get to the truth of the matters and resolve the issues. They seem mostly intent on attracting a base of people that likes their stuff, on saying what it is that they want to say, making names for themselves and so on. And I think that's just a shirking of intellectual responsibility. And then there's the behavior of some of the people, especially the younger value form people. I won't even get into that, but quite reprehensible behavior I've experienced.
So, who is Patrick Murray, and what was this debate all about?
Well, Patrick Murray is a philosopher, professor of philosophy at Creighton University in Nebraska, prominent value form theorist. As you've said, he's written a lot about value form theory over the years, also more generally about Marx's method in science. Well, what we wanted to do, Alan Freeman and I, who edited a journal, we wanted to have a symposium, a series of papers where there was a discussion of value form theory, a debate over value form theory, what value form theorists say, both in itself and what they say about Marx, and to have that debate with people who adhere to the temporal single system interpretation of Marx's value theory. So have an engagement between both sides.
And where did this debate happen?
It was in Critique of Political Economy, which was a short-lived journal that Alan Freeman and I co-edited.
Okay. We can post links to all the papers.
Yeah, the journal is free online, and carries that symposium. So it's got go ahead.
So this debate was 9 years ago, and Murray responded to your criticism 9 years ago, but you haven't replied to him in the meantime. So why is that? Have you been distracted, or did it take you 9 years to figure out how to respond?
Yeah, no, it didn't take me. It did not take me 9 years to figure out how to respond. I got involved in more pressing matters, but also, the attitudes of most of the value form people and the whole circle, not really wanting to engage, not being willing to engage, lack of interest in getting to the truth of what Marx's own theories were. I just found that very frustrating. And, that kind of stuff is meant to frustrate you and make you, go off and do other things. And that happened. But, we tried to get this whole symposium with several, proponents of the temporal single system interpretation, several value form people. And in the end, as it turned out, the only value form contribution we got to the symposium was that of Murray. So it was just, I've always, I guess, wanted to respond, although it really got seriously put on the back burner. But it's been frustrating, and other things, took priority.
There were other papers in the symposium that were also critical, And Murray responds to not just you, right? His paper responds to a lot of different people.
Yeah, since he was the one ending up holding the bag for their side, so to speak, he had this burden of answering three different papers in one paper. And so as it was, we gave him double the space.
But you're looking just to deal with his criticisms of your paper, right?
Yeah. Basically, I can't speak for, the other authors. I can't. He responded to Alan Freeman. I can't represent Alan Freeman. He responded to Michael Posner and Mayan Gonzalez. I can't, speak for them. So, I'll speak for myself in response. But also, there's so much that I really want to and think I need to say that it would be way too much to respond to everything in his article.
Yeah. Well, let's try to get into the substance of some of the disagreements. So, Murray is arguing in his paper that you and the other TSSI authors have basically made a straw man of the value form theory, that there is like an extreme value form theory that he calls the exchange-only variant, in which value is completely determined in exchange when commodities exchange with money. But he's saying that that is just sort of like a straw man version, and that there is a better reading that he calls co-constitutive value form theory. Co-constitutive value form theory, and it's different than the one you're criticizing. And he also argues that that's really what Marx's theory is. So, first of all, what does he mean by co-constitutive value form theory? And is it actually different than the exchange-only variant that he claims is a straw man?
Before I answer that question, let me say a few things, because my way of dealing with criticism might not be familiar to people. What I'm concerned to do, and what I'm always concerned to do in debate, is not just make my points, and I'm not trying to appeal to an audience, to get people to like what I'm saying. I'm trying to get at the truth of matters. Okay, so when I discuss what Murray says, I'm concerned with its accuracy. I'm concerned with the accuracy of what he says about Marx, the accuracy of what he says about what I say, the accuracy in terms of how well it matches, how well it fits the world. And I think there are a lot of errors in what Murray says. And so it's not a question of whether I like it or not like it, whether he's entitled to say what he wants to say. I'm not trying to stop anybody from saying what they want to say, but I am trying to convict him of error. Famously, John Maynard Keynes says in economics, you can't convict your opponent of errors. You can only, try to persuade him or convince him. I don't accept that. Okay. I think that, scholarship and the development of ideas requires that we separate the wheat from the chaff, what is accurate from what is erroneous. And if we don't get that, we never get any forward progress, because it all gets mushed up together. And, it depends on what you like. And if you happen to like mainlining Lysol, that's as good as, a real cure for the coronavirus and so forth. So I don't think we can have that. And so what I'm concerned to do is to make points and to demonstrate them to the audience, not to appeal to the audience in terms of, you'll like my views more than his views. I'm not trying to trash somebody. It's not a question of people. It's a question of what are the points being made? Are they accurate? Are they distorted? Are they completely wrong? And to be able to demonstrate, I have to provide evidence. I have to provide argument. So if I seem to be belaboring points, it's because I'm trying to do more than just get to the bottom line and here's my conclusion. Okay, my conclusions don't matter. Nobody should be accepting any conclusions, especially mine, including mine. Nobody should accept any conclusions, just on somebody's say so or because they happen to like it. Okay, I have to demonstrate the points, and that's going to take some time.
Well, let's deal with some of the specifics of what Murray's arguing. So, for one, first of all, he's saying that there is a difference between an exchange-only version of value form theory and his version of value form theory, which he thinks is more sophisticated, that he calls co-constitutive value form theory, and that you have kind of collapsed all value form theories into this extreme version of exchange only. Do you agree or acknowledge that he's correct, that there is a difference between the exchange only and other types of value form approaches?
Yes, there is a difference. How meaningful that difference is another matter. Okay. So he posits two versions: the exchange-only variant of value form theory, and his own, shared by other people like Chris Arthur and Heinrich and so forth. He calls that co-constitutive. Okay, what he means by the exchange-only variant is the one that holds that commodities' values are determined in exchange. Full stop. That's the exchange-only variant. Whatever they happen to sell for is their value. So value is the same thing as price. In Murray's mind, the co-constitutive view is different because it holds that both production and exchange contribute to or somehow involved in constituting a commodity's value. The commodity has a value in a certain sense when it emerges from the process of production, but that's only a potential value according to this co-constitutive view. So it obtains a potential value in production, but it obtains only the commodity only obtains an actual value when it is sold, by being sold, and the magnitude of its value, how much it's actually worth, becomes fully determinate, they say, only when it's sold and by being sold.
Right. That value exists in some sort of potential form that then is realized in exchange. And so you need co-constitutive means that it's constituted two different ways, or it's together, that there's this production side and that there's this exchange side, right?
Yes, I should say a word about realized. And he uses generally the word actualized, and I use that as well because there's another sense of realized in accounting and commerce that means something entirely different, like a realized capital gain. And, of course, value is only realized when the thing is sold. That's just the definition. Capital gain accrues if the value of the stock share or house there's an accrual of a capital gain if it's worth more than it was before. But the owner only realizes the capital gain by getting cash for that. Okay, so that there's no disagreement about a commodity's value only being realized in that sense. That's definitional. The real issue is a commodity's value only potential rather than actual prior to sale? Okay, so that's where, I think that the value form stuff really doesn't make much sense, and it certainly is not Marx's view.
We know value form people will argue that, look, if a commodity doesn't get sold, then it never actualizes its value. The person who makes it never receives any money for it. So the process of buying and selling must be an important stage in how something becomes value, right? But then on the other hand, we know that commodities have value before they've been sold. You can go on Amazon and look at the going price for any number of commodities and know that they are worth a certain amount of value before and after they've been sold. We know sometimes people hold on to commodities instead of money because they retain value, at least some commodities do, over time. So how do we parse out like the relationship of buying and selling to the commodities value?
Right. Well, basically what you have expressed is not just on the one hand and the other hand two ways of looking at it. You've expressed a contradiction. Okay? Mm-hmm. There is one view of the matter which says that value is not actualized until the commodity is sold. And if it's not sold, it's never actualized. So the commodity only has at most, one could say, a potential or anticipated value. You have you have an opposite view when you say, no, I go onto Amazon, I go this way, I see what the value of the thing is. Mm-hmm. Okay, it has a value, and people compute the value, and they work with the amounts of value, accountants and so forth, all throughout, not only at this end moment when the thing might be exchanged. Okay, you got two very different understandings of value there, and they're contradictory. Right. They're
Right.
contradictory. So I would never agree that the commodity's value is only actualized when it sells for money. I don't even really know what that means. I know it means that it's supposed to mean that it only sells for money when it sells for money. Okay, that's realized in the commercial sense of like a realized capital gain. Okay, so you have a house, it's worth more. You have a capital gain. Capital gain accrues. Okay, you're richer than you were before. That's true whether or not you sell the house. Okay, and this is not just my view. This is the way accountants understand it.
Right.
Okay, so the capital gain accrues. You're richer. You haven't realized the capital gain in the technical sense that you haven't obtained money. You haven't obtained the increase in value in the form of money. Your increase in value is in the form of the house. It's worth more. Okay, but technically speaking, what realization means is if you sell the house and you get more than you paid for it, then you've realized the capital gain. So it's only a question of the increase in value being in the form of money versus physical form.
Right. Right.
Okay, so that's all I will say, and to my mind, it's like it's a whole different kind of issue than what makes value actual, which I don't even really understand what that is supposed to be telling us.
So, back to Murray's complaint that you were collapsing his co-constitutive value form theory into this exchange-only sort of simplified strawman version. Is that correct? Do you think you were wrong to do that?
No, we didn't collapse the one into the other. It collapses itself.
One implies.
Well, the bottom line of the so-called co-constitutive version is the same as the bottom line of the exchange-only version. What they both say is that the actual magnitude of a commodity's value is affected by exchange conditions, what happens at the point of sale. The so-called co-constitutive position is that a commodity's value is not ultimately the potential value it had when it emerged from production process. Because of what happens in exchange, its actual value is a different amount of value. So when all is said and done, the co-constitutive version collapses into the exchange-only version, that the commodity's value is ultimately the amount of money for which it sells. So all this stuff about potential value and actual value reminds me of what Paul Samuelson wrote about way back when about so-called solutions to the transformation problem. That was about a half century ago. Here's what he wrote about those so-called solutions. Samuelson writes, quote, contemplate two alternative and discordant systems, one of values, one of production prices. Write one down. Now transform by taking an eraser and rubbing it out. Then fill in the other one. Voila! You have completed your transformation algorithm. So what I think we have here is you write down the potential value of a commodity as it emerges from production. Then you take an eraser and rub that out. Then you write down the actual value that the commodity has when it's sold. Voila. That's your co-constitutive value theory as far as I can see.
Murray claims that his co-constitutive value form paradigm is what Marx is doing in Capital. But you have the opposite view. So how is the co-constitutive value form paradigm different than Marx's theory of how commodities values are determined?
Right. I should say that Murray is kind of like the cheese that stands alone here. Most value form people either say, well, Marx didn't really have, this value form view, or they'll say he was ambivalent and sometimes he had it, sometimes he didn't. He should have had it. As far as I know, at least among the older generation, Murray is alone in saying that, the value form stuff is Marxist theory and unambivalently and so forth. There's no real connection. I mean, there's some sort of relationship between it and what Marx said. What Marx said is the opposite of what they say. You can take volume 1 of Marx's Capital, go into the first chapter, and on the 5th page you read, what exclusively determines the magnitude of value of any article is the amount of labor socially necessary for its production. Okay, that's an unambiguous, straightforward statement. What exclusively determines the magnitude of value of any article is the amount of labor socially necessary for its production. Not, potentially this, but actually later in the market. None of that. And I know some people like to glom onto the word socially necessary, and twist them until Marx confesses, the market determines whether the commodity is socially necessary, yada, yada, yada. Okay, but Marx is not talking in general about what's socially necessary. He's talking about whether the amount of labor that goes into producing the item is socially necessary in order to produce it. He's not talking about whether the commodity is socially necessary. He's talking about whether the amount of labor is socially necessary. He defines on the same page, for God's sakes, he defines the amount of labor being socially necessary to be the amount that is needed to produce the article under normal production conditions and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor. Okay, so what is socially necessary labor is based solely on production conditions, not exchange conditions, not by the social necessity of the commodity or anything like that. Okay, it's just really straightforward. So it actually has nothing to do with whether the commodity even exists or not. It may not be even produced. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's sold. It doesn't even matter whether it's produced. The amount of the value of that commodity, whether it exists or not, is the amount of labor that is socially necessary, that is needed to produce it, whether or not it's produced under normal conditions of production with the average degree of skill and intensity. That's what he means, okay, by socially necessary. And then we could take things like surplus value, profit. Where does it arise? Well, according to this co-constitutive value form theory, well, it potentially exists when the commodity is produced, but it actually exists and the amount of it changes, depending on what happens at the point of sale. Okay, but if you look like in chapter 7 of Capital, where Marx explains the origin of surplus value according to his theory, he says that the transformation of money into capital, that is to say the generation of surplus value or profit, he says, quote, it does not take place in circulation, in exchange, because what happens there in the exchange process is only an introduction to the valorization process, the process of values self-expanding, which is entirely confined to the sphere of production. Okay, entirely confined to the sphere of production. That's another unambiguous indication of what Marx's theory is. And he's saying here, what happens in exchange or circulation is an introduction to all of this, because he was thinking of in the market, prior to production, workers are hired in the market, means of production are bought in the market, and then they enter into production. So the idea that the later sale of the product of this process could alter the surplus value that was generated in the process, that was like the furthest thing from Marx's mind here. He didn't even mention it. He didn't even mention it in order to say, no, that's not part of what's going on. It was like unimaginable that anybody could think that the surplus value doesn't really exist until the product is sold. At least he didn't mention it right there.
So, the value form people, and Murray as one of them, they do quote passages from Marx, and they interpret them in ways that they claim suggest that the commodity's value is determined in part by what occurs in exchange, when it's exchanged, after it's been produced, right? Like they might say that, the production is for exchange, so the fact that it's going to be exchanged is important, or socially necessary labor time, we don't know what it is until we take our commodity to the market to compare it with other commodities, or we don't know if our commodity has been devalued in some way until it shows up in the marketplace to compare with other commodities. So how do we address those sort of arguments?
Well, a lot of things that are wrong with all of these arguments, and the essential problem is they operate, these people, with too few distinctions. So everything gets bundled together, and you bundle different things together, you end up with, value ultimately being actualized and its magnitude determined in exchange. Let me address two things that you mentioned right there. We don't know, and the producer doesn't know, and the seller doesn't know what the value of a commodity is in many cases, and only, or the price, and only exchange will reveal that. Okay, that's a valid point, but there's a confusion there between what is and what we know. Okay, in philosophy, this is known as the distinction between between ontology, what is, and epistemology, what we know. So what exists is independent of what we happen to know. There was germs creating disease before people had a germ theory of disease. Okay, so commodities have values, and their values are determinate, fully formed and determinate according to Marx's theory, even if people don't know. So that's the one issue. You mentioned something else right after that. Do you remember?
Maybe it was devaluation.
Ah, yes, very, very, very important. Yeah, you also mentioned the idea that, something could have a value, and then by the time it gets to market, it no longer has that value. It might not have any value, it might have a lower value. That's absolutely correct, okay? So to say that values are determined in production, what Marx does not mean by that is that they are fully formed inalterably for all time. They can change later. By the time the commodity gets to market, it could have a lower value, no value at all. Even subsequent, the thing could be sold, and it could be sitting, in your basement, and then it may not have a value anymore, might have a lower value after sale. The values of things are continually changing, okay? And in Marx's theory, what is exclusively determining the magnitude of the value is not how much labor, it took to produce it originally, but the amount of labor that would be socially necessary to reproduce it right now, okay? So that's continually changing. So, people see passages and they say, Marx is saying the thing had a value and now it's got a different value. That's right, and it does not contradict the idea that the magnitude of value is exclusively determined in production. You get other failures to make needed distinctions. For instance, when they talk about exchange, there are like two really different meanings of exchange, especially in Marx's work. There's exchange as like a general set of social processes that are such that the market is very involved in, the distribution of products and the allocation of resources. We have, a whole society oriented around exchange. Yeah, and you're always going to get Marx saying, this matters. Then there is a different meaning of exchange. That's a particular phase in the trajectory of a commodity. First it's produced, then it goes to market, then it's sold, then, it may be consumed. And so that exchange is a particular phase of this trajectory. What Marx says is that particular phase after production, when the commodity is in market, that is not something that determines in any way the value of the commodity or the price. So there's a failure to make that distinction, and that's a really important distinction that was noted about a century ago by I. Rubin, who was a victim of Stalin. So yeah. Another issue is Marx will at various times say that demand matters to price, and demand even matters to value. And if you don't make the needed distinction between dependent on demand conditions and determined in exchange, you're going to take those statements about demand by Marx and say, here Marx is saying that exchange is determining value. No, he's saying that in part, in very specific ways, demand conditions are partly determinative of the magnitude of commodities' values. Not maybe in the way that people think about it, but in certain ways, yes. But that's very different from being determined in exchange. I mean, demand does not exist in exchange. Demand is a general social entity, so to speak, that impinges on what commodities are worth, and the state of demand, whether or not this particular item is being bought and sold at the moment.
So Murray writes that your paper criticized the value form paradigm by, quote, identifying money and the monetary character of capitalism as this distinguishing feature. He quoted your statement that, quote, this is particularly pronounced in the work of Arthur, who argues that capitalism is essentially a monetary system. And Murray's response to you was that, quote, capitalism is essentially a monetary system. Money and circulation are essential to it. And money is the actuality of value, inasmuch as value cannot be actualized without it. And this is a central point in the value form theory. So, what do you think about that response?
I don't think much of it, actually. Arthur says capitalism is essentially a monetary system. I replied, Marx didn't agree that it's essentially a monetary system. And I discussed the textual evidence. So Murray comes in, it is too essentially a monetary system.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of childlike. What are we supposed to do? Go back and forth? Is not, is too, is not.
Yeah.
I mean, right. It's not a way of arguing.
But he does get a little more specific later in the paper. He writes, quote, Kleiman argues that neither money nor circulation is the distinctive feature of capitalism. And then he goes on to argue that they are the distinctive features.
Yeah, that was an attempt by him to make it into an issue of me versus them, my view versus their view. Instead of what I was actually doing was addressing Marx's view and Arthur's view. I said Arthur's position is consonant with everyday thinking. You know, we live in a market-oriented society. Money is all around us. Everybody thinks that money is the essence of the system. But then I wrote, quote, Marx explicitly rejected the very concept of a money economy because and I'm quoting Marx, what it stresses as the distinctive feature is actually not the economy proper, that is to say the production process itself, but rather the mode of commerce, close quote. So what I did was provide a statement about what Marx's view was. He rejected the concept of a monetary economy because what it stresses as distinctive is not the economy proper, the production process, but the mode of commerce. Okay? And it's important that we understand that what I'm doing is discussing what Marx's view was, because Murray claims that his version of value form theory was Marx's actual theory, and I'm presenting evidence right there that it wasn't. And you can't properly challenge my textual evidence about what Marx's theory was by Murray telling me why he disagrees with my view. But that's what he was trying to do. So rather than confront the evidence that his view and Marx's view are opposed here, he changed the subject, making it about my view versus their view. And so he makes the whole issue of Marx's view versus their view just disappear in the process.
You wrote that instead of money and circulation being capitalism's distinctive features, that Marx singled out labor power appearing as a commodity was capitalism's distinctive feature. And in response, Murray wrote that yes, that is a distinctive feature of capitalism, but also the monetary system is a distinctive feature, and that you don't have to choose between these two features. So, how do you reply to that kind of argument?
Okay, again, first of all, it's irrelevant in this context whether it is or is not distinctive to capitalism that it's a monetary system, because the issue here is what Marx identified as capitalism's distinguishing feature. Look, it's possible that capitalism has a whole lot of different distinctive features, things that are not found in other societies. The fact remains that what Marx singled out as the essential distinguishing feature, what he regarded as essential, is the fact that labor power appears as a commodity in capitalism. Okay, second of all, when Murray says that it's wrong-headed to want to choose between a monetary economy and commodification of labor power as a distinguishing feature, since they're inseparable and they're both unique to capitalism, well, he's right that they're inseparable. He's maybe right about the uniqueness to capitalism, although there have been other monetary economies in some sense. But in any case, he's ignoring other important considerations. Okay, things could be inseparable, unique, but what about the difference between essence and appearance? Okay, he's supposedly defending the idea here, which Arthur wrote. He's defending the idea that capitalism is essentially a monetary system. So the difference between essence and appearance matters here, and it's just nowhere in his reply. He's talking about things are inseparable, being unique. What about what's essential versus what's a form of appearance? So what he's saying is if two things are inseparable and they're both unique to capitalism, then it's wrong-headed to, quote, choose between them. But appearances and essences are always inseparable. And some appearances are uniquely appearances of particular essences. And certain appearances may be necessary. They may have to exist in order for the essence to exist. Sure. But none of those things, inseparable, unique, necessary, none of those things turn appearances into essences. They don't eliminate the difference. So they don't make it wrong-headed to say, this over here, the commodification of labor power, that's the essence, while as over here, the monetary aspects of the economy, that's a form of appearance. Doesn't make it wrong-headed to say that. And that's what Marx was doing. So when he argues that the commodification of labor power is the distinguishing characteristic of the capitalist mode of production, Marx explicitly rejected the idea that he was saying that because of the form of appearance, because in the quote, because in the form of wages, labor is bought with money. That was not his point. The commodification of labor power was to him the essence. Purchasing labor power by paying money wages was just the form of appearance. And relatedly, in the same place, this is in Volume 2 of Capital, relatedly, Marx stressed that the commodification of labor power is the essence, while the purchase and sale of labor power is just the form of appearance that the commodification of labor power takes. He wrote, quote, once labor power is found on the market as a commodity, its sale and purchase is no more striking than the sale and purchase of any other commodity. What is characteristic, of capitalism is not that the commodity labor power can be bought, but the fact that labor power appears as a commodity, close quote. Now, for a lot of people, they can't make heads or tails of this. What's the difference between something being a commodity and being bought? To them, it's the same thing. But no, for Marx, there's a distinction. Telling us was that the essential characteristic here isn't what goes on in the market, but the continually renewed separation of working people from means of production of their own. And that is what turns labor power into commodity. Okay? And once labor power is a commodity because the workers are separated from their own means of production, then of course the commodity labor power can be bought and sold. Okay? But that's just a form of appearance of the relationship. The essential relationship is that the workers are separated from their own means of production. That's what makes this capitalism. That was Marx's view.
So also on this issue of money being necessary and inseparable to other things in capitalism, Murray objected to something you wrote about Proudhonism in your paper. You wrote, quote, by developing the money form of value from out of the duality inherent in each commodity, he showed that the money relations against which Proudhonists railed are manifestations rather than essences, merely the necessary consequence of the inherent contradictions of commodities and commodity production, end quote. And Murray responded, merely, necessary, inherent, Kleiman writes as if their mistake was to focus on money when value is the real target. True as far as it goes, but Marx's value form point is that money and value are inseparable.
Yeah, here we have the same problem in play. Murray's aversion, at least in this case, it's an aversion to distinguishing between essence and appearance. And you see this when he mocks the fact that I wrote merely the necessary consequence. He goes, merely necessary? I mean, how could something be merely if it's necessary? But I'm sure that if we had a different context, he'd see how ludicrous it is to object to saying that what's necessary is merely. Imagine you got somebody who he gets stabbed in the heart multiple times. So his shirt is sopping wet with blood. The blood is inseparable from the stabbing. And the blood's a necessary consequence of the stabbing. Absolutely necessary consequence. But hello, the blood is indeed merely a necessary consequence. The essential change that's taken place here, the key cause of the bleeding, is that the guy was stabbed in the heart. Okay, not the fact that the shirt's sopping wet with blood. So I would say, like, in a certain sense, the Proudhonists and the value formists are like somebody who makes a big thing out of the fact that the guy's got blood all over his shirt, while they have a whole lot less to say about, if not completely ignore, the fact that he was stabbed. So something can be necessary, but doesn't make it the essential thing that's going on. So Murray claims that Marx's point here was that money and value are inseparable. I just don't find that plausible at all. It doesn't take a Marx to tell us that money and value are inseparable. Anybody can make that point. Something every child knows, so to speak. I mean, is it at all plausible that Marx spent hundreds of hours over many, many, many years in an effort to make the obvious point that money and value are inseparable? No, the textual evidence is pretty damn clear that his point against the Proudhonists here was that their mistake was to focus on money when value and commodity production should have been their real targets. Can I give a couple of examples?
Yes, please do.
Chapter 1 of Volume 1 of Capital, in that famous third section on the value form. And then again in the second chapter, Marx criticizes what he calls the petty bourgeois socialism of Proudhon and others who want to get rid of money but keep the production of commodities in existence. And in both places, he compares their position to wanting to get rid of the Pope, not any particular Pope, the position of Pope. He compares it to somebody who would want to get rid of the position of Pope while leaving Catholicism in existence. It's pretty weird when you have an author say one thing in chapter 1 and then just a few pages later really say the exact same thing with the exact same analogy in chapter 2. But that's what Marx did. So what is the point here? The fact that there's a pope, that's merely the necessary consequence of Catholicism. I mean, that's the way Catholicism works. If you don't want there to be a pope, you have to eliminate Catholicism, not yammer on and on about, how bad the pope is. Okay? If you don't want a guy's shirt to become sopping wet with blood, you have to prevent him from being stabbed, not yammer on and on about how horrible the blood is. And if you don't like capitalism's monetary relations and their effects, you have to get rid of commodity production and value, not yammer on and on about capitalism being essentially a monetary system. That's what I think Marx is trying to show in that whole third section of chapter 1 on the value form.
As we do at every episode, we're going to take a moment to hear from Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Hello, this is Anne Jacquard, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist-Humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Today's political, economic, and environmental crises present a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, which demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not socialism. MHI's ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements, of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. We intend to practice, as well as espouse, a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice.
When Marx was arguing against Proudhon, there were real political questions at stake, not just sort of abstract theoretical things. Are there also political issues at stake here in this debate over the value form?
There are definitely political issues that the controversy impinges on. Are they trying to make a particular political point? I don't know. It's generally not, stated in their writings. But clearly, whole sets of issues concerning redistributionist politics, opposition to neoliberalism, thinking that there's something, particularly bad about the greater prominence of finance and money that we have now as compared to, let's say, a half century ago. All of those kinds of things are caught up here. And I view the prevalence of value form theory today as part and parcel of this move of the left to demonize neoliberalism, rather than focusing their ire on the capitalist mode of production. But I can't say in any particular case, that any author in particular has any political motives here. It's just not clear from the writing. But there is a lot of railing against the Pope instead of Catholicism. There is a lot of railing against, certain monetary forms of appearance and markets, and much less on capitalist production in their writings.
Well, we're going to have to make this a two-part episode, I believe, because there is a lot more to talk about. So stay tuned for the next episode of Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast, where we will bring you the second part of this conversation about value form theory and about Andrew's debate with Patrick Murray. If you like the podcast, please do stop by Marxist-Humanistinitiative.org and leave us a comment. You can listen to more episodes there. Please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you listen to it on. Leave us a comment, rate the podcast, share it with friends and enemies. And of course, we would love to hear from you. So leave us a comment, drop us a line.